Reports suggest that the man arrested in connection with the massacre of 18 people in Ngobozana village in Lusikisiki in the Eastern Cape has previous convictions. It's believed his previous conviction is that of murder and he was out on parole. Let's look at some of the reasons why an offender who was placed on parole would then choose to reoffend. We speak to Lungile Ngwenya, National Institute for Crime Prevention and Reintegration of Offenders Operations Manager. Good evening to you, Lungile, and thank you so much for your time. Why would someone who's been given a second shot at freedom then reoffend, potentially finding themselves back behind bars?
Good evening, Bomgazi. Thank you very much for having me. I think the issue of reoffending is a topical issue that needs to be addressed collectively by the society. There are a number of factors really that can lead one to actually reoffend. For example, one of them is mental health issues. Most people that are coming from correctional centers, they've got untreated trauma. And if we don't support them, it becomes much more difficult for them to be integrated. And critical to our society is the issue of stigma and discrimination, because you know that South African society actually adopts a punitive approach, if I can put it that way, because we actually continuously label the people that are coming from correctional centers. So without support from the community, it becomes difficult for them to be socially reintegrated. There are a number of barriers that I can mention. Some of them, the issues of lack of employment, the issues of lack of education, substance abuse, the issues of the environment, for example. If one is released into an environment that has got prevalence of crime and violence, it becomes difficult for them to actually to be reintegrated, because they will actually continue engaging into those particular issues.
So, Lungile, what does it mean then for the process that is in place in the lead up to, meeting the parole board and then the offender then being released? Because one would assume the things you are raising here, of course, apart from the issue of employment, I'm talking about the issue of untreated trauma, the issue around, the mental health issues and all of that would have been addressed potentially?
Potentially, that's the objective of incarceration. We want those issues to be addressed. But if we look at our system, the correctional centers, it has got a number of challenges. One of them, which is overcrowding. So one can question the fact to say, to what extent is rehabilitation occurring in such an environment? If I can contextualize it from the basis of the rules, we've got what we call the Nelson Mandela rules, which actually highlights how offenders are supposed to be detained. But one, if looks into our own system, you can argue and say that offenders are not actually detained in a human rights system, because most of their rights are actually being violated. So in that particular regard, it becomes difficult for one to say rehabilitation actually is occurring in the required scale. I'm not saying it's the Department of Correctional Services not doing whatever that they're supposed to do. What I'm saying is that there is a lot of work that needs to be done. For one to be considered for parole, actually, there are a number of steps that needs to be taken. One of the steps is to ensure that an assessment is conducted by the social worker and the other experts who actually recommend to the parole board that this person is actually qualifying to be released on parole. That particular step is a step that is taken to ensure a gradual return into society for that particular offender. Most probably the offender was participating in a rehabilitation program, they were complying with their sentence plan, but when they are outside the correctional centers, it becomes difficult for reintegration because the society does not actually welcome them due to the issues of stigma as well as discrimination. So it's a complex issue.
And how do we begin to have a conversation at societal level as well? Because that's another layer that you've just raised right now, because yes, you are releasing them and potentially maybe the victim-offender dialogue has taken place, and then you find that the victims, possibly for them or even the families, are saying it's okay to release them, but they get into the communities and the communities are not so receptive. So how then do we begin to have, as a community or even a nation, this particular aspect of a conversation in order to ensure that there's also things that are done in that regard as well?
Yes, I think it's the effect of changing or rethinking our justice approach. We have a restorative justice approach which we are implementing as a country, but we are not yet there. Those conversations needs to start while the offender is still in the correctional centers, where we involve communities to come and participate. Because if we release people without adequate planning, it becomes difficult for them to be reintegrated. For example, we have got various community leaders that should play a pivotal role, because if you look at the white paper on corrections, it highlights that rehabilitation and reintegration is a collective responsibility, but the societal responsibility is not actually effective, in the sense that there is no adequate funding and support from those particular actors who have got the political will to do so, to actually assist civil societies who have got the solution to take the country forward. So
Yeah.
the justice system on its own, it needs to start to have serious conversation around how can we rethink our justice to actually transform these offenders from a position of being liabilities to a position of being assets. Because in actual essence, to keep an offender inside correctional service is very expensive, but we don't have investment outside to keep them outside prison. So we invest in keeping them inside, but we don't invest in keeping them outside. So it's a system that needs to be overhauled, if I can put it that way.
So as you speak about an overhauling, would you say that, because when you speak to the department, for example, as we've seen some cases in the past of offenders who are placed on parole reoffending, they speak about the success of this particular process, and they say that for them the rehabilitation program is in fact working, and they say that they do only see possibly a smaller number of some of those who then come back and reoffend, but they say there is a large number of those who then do go out there and make a life for themselves. So when we're talking about this overhaul, are we then saying that even those ones that could potentially be seen as success stories may not necessarily be success stories?
Not in that manner. I'm not adopting a blanket approach in terms of that particular aspect. What I'm saying is that if we are to effectively reduce the rate of reoffending, we need to look into rethinking our justice system. The reoffending rate in South Africa is sitting at 94%, if I can put it that way. And most of them, they reoffend within the first 3 years of release. And if you look at the cohort of those people who are actually reoffending, they are around the ages of 18 to 45. So that is a risk trajectory that we need to invest in terms of addressing the issue of reoffending. So the success stories will be there, but in terms of them getting the adequate support, it becomes a challenge. I've got so many clients that I've worked with in the past that have got success stories, but for them to get that particular success stories, you would have done a lot in terms of advocacy, in terms of lobbying, engaging a number of stakeholders to ensure that they open the doors for them. So it needs a collaborative approach in terms of identifying who are the critical stakeholders that are supposed to come and play. We are talking about the issues, stakeholders such as the SAPs, the courts, the municipalities, people in the business community, and also trying to rethink some of the barriers around legislation. Because if you look at our legislation, it tends to act as a barrier when it comes to the issues of expungement of criminal record for some of the offenders. It's like you have been incarcerated, you have served the objective of being incarcerated because you now want to become a law-abiding citizen, but there is this barrier that actually makes it difficult for you. Therefore, what will you do? You will go back and start.
Yeah.
Because in the prison system, you're actually accepted as someone who's respected, rather than the society which actually discriminates and doesn't respect those people who are released from prison.
Lungile, thank you so much for your time this evening. Certainly, you leave us with quite some serious thoughts to ponder, and it will be interesting to speak to the Department of Correctional Services as well, against the backdrop of some of what you've said and raised as concerns this evening. That's Lungile Ngwenya, National Institute for Crime Prevention and Reintegration of Offenders Operations Manager.